One of my favorite late November traditions is going back for seconds on Thanksgiving. Now, in years past, we've only had one helping of Big Ten football with those Thanksgiving leftovers on Black Friday, but this year we're going back for seconds on Black Friday with those Thanksgiving leftovers. We've got a double dip of Big Ten football, and we've got previews and predictions for Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Nebraska, Iowa.
From LA to Piscataway, all Big Ten all year long. This is Big Ten 10.
This might be my favorite football watching day of the entire year. Folks, Thanksgiving is an elite holiday. It is the holiday. Food, football, no presents, it doesn't get any better than that. And it's the best leftovers of the year. Now, in years past, we had the turkey, the casserole, the stuffing. I'm drooling just thinking about it, certainly right now, but it was just that one football game, Nebraska and Iowa. We've got two helpings this year. So you gotta portion out maybe some of the leftovers. You gotta have some for lunch, and you got to have some for dinner as well. Now, we're going to preview these games in a little bit of a reverse order. I'm going to start first with the Nebraska Cornhuskers taking on against the Iowa Hawkeyes. It's my channel. It's my previews. I can do it whichever way that I choose to do it. Nebraska had a really good offensive performance last week. Dana Holgorsen has come into this team in Lincoln, Nebraska under Matt Rule, and he's had a fair amount of success early on in this thing. They looked all right against USC. They had their best offensive performance of the season against the Wisconsin Badgers. 44 points, 473 total yards. Dylan Raiola had his best game as a Husker, going 28 of 38, 293, and a touchdown. The big question is, okay, you did that at home against Wisconsin. A solid defense in the Wisconsin Badgers that was without their top defensive player in Hunter Wohler. Now, can you do it on the road? Can you do it at night? Can you do it against a really good defense? And can you do it against the Iowa Hawkeyes? That will be the true test to see just how far Dana Holgorsen has brought forward this offense at Nebraska. Now, when I look at what Nebraska can do and maybe how they should attack this Iowa Hawkeye defense, I think they got to attack down the field. Like, you look at some of these matchups for Iowa this season. You look at the Iowa State game that they lost. You look at the Michigan State game. You look at the Ohio State game. You look at some of those games that they came up on the short end of the stick. Some of these offenses were able to create some plays out there on the perimeter. Now, Iowa and Phil Parker, of course, have a great defensive culture, and this year is another really good defense. But I will say this about the secondary for the Iowa Hawkeyes. I think that they are fundamentally sound, but I'm just not sure how athletic they are. We've seen in some of those losses that teams can out-athlete them, out on the perimeter, and I think that's what Nebraska needs to try to do. I think they need to be able to attack down the field. We know the suspects out there. We know the Jamal Banks. We know the Isaiah Nair, right? We know who are some of these guys that are going to be able to stretch the football down the field. Dylan Raiola, with Dana Holgorsen now calling the plays, they've done a lot better job at taking advantage of Dylan's strengths, and that's arm strength, ripping the ball down the middle of the field, ripping the ball out on the perimeter with some really accurate throws as well. So Dana, get Dylan that confidence going early. I mentioned earlier in the week that this is a Nebraska offense that's playing with a lot more confidence, certainly right now. And I'm not sure how successful Nebraska is going to be able to be running the football up the middle. This is just a really good, really solid defensive line. There's not an Epinesa. There's not a superstar, right, on this Iowa defensive line. But when you look all across, when you look at the Ethan Hurkitts, when you look at the Aaron Graves, when you look at the Deontay Craigs, when you look at the Y.A. Blacks, they're just a really solid unit that works really well together. And then when you look at what they have at linebacker, of course, Jay Higgins, over 100 tackles this season. Surprise, surprise. Nick Jackson, of course, is really good in the middle over there. So, and then that Nebraska offensive line, I think it's going to be a little bit tested a little bit more this week against this Iowa defense. So it's going to be very interesting to see how that matchup plays out. Can Nebraska be as productive as they were last week? I think that's going to be a tall task going on the road to this environment against Iowa, but if they can come close to that, and if they can hit some explosive plays over the top and be able to balance out their offense that way, this is a Nebraska offense that could maybe put up some points against the Iowa Hawkeyes. Iowa needs to keep everything in front of them, right? I think if they play that Iowa game where they keep everything, they don't allow some big plays over the top, they keep everything in front of them, they're just like every other year, they're a very good tackling team out there. If Iowa does that, I think that they can certainly come away with a victory. Here's the interesting thing about Iowa's defense, right? And this is an Iowa football team that's been really good at home at Kinnick Stadium this year, but Iowa's defense has had some peaks, they've had some valleys. Like in their victories this season, it's looked like a typical Phil Parker defense. In their 7 wins this season, they've given up an average of 12.5 points per game, but their losses are a little bit of a different story. If that's the peak, we're headed down into the valley. They've given up on average 26.7 points per game in their losses this season. A little bit of feast or famine this year for the Iowa Hawkeyes. Are they going to be sitting at the big boy table at Black Friday leftover dinner, or are they going to be sitting at the little kids table as it pertains to their defensive performance this year? They need to get pressure on Dylan Raiola, try to force the freshman into some mistakes, because this is an Iowa secondary, the Ball Hawkeyes, as I've called them in the past. This is an Iowa secondary that's been good at taking the football away. They are tied for the Big Ten lead with 16 interceptions this season. Let's move from the Iowa on defense. Let's move to them on the offensive side of the football. Their identity is number 2 in black and gold. Iowa is Caleb Johnson. Caleb Johnson is Iowa. Only 3 teams have held Caleb to under 100 yards this year. It's obvious, blatantly obvious, that they need to get him going. If Caleb Johnson does not get going in this game, they're going to have troubles against the Nebraska Cornhuskers. And, you know, when I look at Nebraska, we talked about the peaks and the valleys of Iowa defensively. Nebraska has kind of been in that same mold as well. Like when you look at Iowa and you look at Nebraska, you see strong defensive cultures. You see strong defensive teams with Phil Parker on one side, Tony White on the other side from a defensive coordinator standpoint. But you look at Nebraska, they played really well against Ohio State. They played extremely well against Colorado, but Nebraska, you know, didn't play a great game against Illinois. Of course, they did not play a great game against Indiana. Like they've had, you know, some games where they've looked really good. They've had some games where they haven't looked as good. For Nebraska, they need to be able to sell out on the run. You need to make good old Jackson, Briggs, and Stratton beat you. Like that's what you need to do. Contain this run game. Bring 8 guys. Bring 9 guys into the box. I don't care what it takes. Iowa does not really have a threat on the outside to be able to beat you. You need to contain. You don't need to stop it, because it's insanely difficult to stop Caleb Johnson and, of course, this great run-blocking offensive line. But you need to be able to contain it somehow and then let your defensive backs cover against this Iowa passing game. We haven't really gotten, I know there was that Iowa game, or that UCLA game, where Jackson Stratton came into, but you need to be able to see what happens when Jackson has to throw the ball on 3rd and 8, when Jackson has to be able to make a play on 3rd and 9 to be able to keep the sticks moving. Nebraska, bottle up that run game, get off the field, keep your defense fresh. This has been a series where it is almost a stone cold lead pipe lock that it is going to be a close game. It is going to be a 1-possession game. The last 6 games in this series have been decided by 7 points or less. Since Nebraska joined the Big Ten in 2011, and this was a yearly matchup, only 4 of 13 games have been decided by more than a touchdown. And a lot of times in those 4 games, it's been very lopsided. So it's either a blowout or it's either a 1-possession game. I think that this is going to be a close game. I think that this is almost guaranteed to be a 1-possession type of game. So what happens in a close game like that? Nebraska has lost a lot of close games, of course, over the years, even under the Matt Rule regime. Iowa has been able to win a lot of those close games, right? What do? They make a defensive score. They create turnovers. They punt the football well. They create special teams played as well. Caden Weegan has been a big part of that, certainly this season. And that's why I tend to favor the Iowa Hawkeyes in this football game. I think it's going to be tough for Nebraska to go on the road at night into Kinnick, where Iowa has played really well this season, and be able to get a win. I think the Hawkeyes run the football good enough. I think Nebraska is going to sell out on it. I think that Iowa is going to have to work to get theirs, so to speak, in the run game in this game. But I think Iowa's defense is going to mix things up, and I think they're going to do well enough, keep this Nebraska offense in check in this game. I've got the Hawkeyes 20 and the Nebraska Cornhuskers 17. Earlier in the day, we're doing this in reverse order, right? Earlier in the day, we've got the Minnesota Golden Gophers taking on the Wisconsin Badgers for one of the best trophies in all of college football. Paul Bunyan's axe. Who's going to be chopping it down when all is said and done in Madison? There is a lot of motivation for both of these teams. We'll get into that. There is a lot of desperation right now for the Wisconsin Badgers. Their 22-year bowl streak is on the line at Camp Randall Stadium on Saturday against their arch rival. It is the third longest bowl streak in FBS. Wisconsin has been a model of consistency throughout college football. This is very important to this Wisconsin fan base. And being able to get a win over Minnesota to keep that going is going to be very important. If they lose, it'll be a 2-game drop from last season. They went 7-5 in the regular year last year. We'll see if they end up 5-7. But not making a bowl, I think this year in and of itself has been a little bit of a wake-up call for Wisconsin in year 2 of Luke Fickell. But I think not making a bowl game would be a major wake-up call for this Wisconsin football program. I think that there would be some major changes, even more than there already will be, right? They've already fired Phil Longo within this program. I think Wisconsin's going to pull out all the stops to try to get this win in this football game. Now, big question I have about this game, can Braden Locke protect the football? Braden Locke has thrown an interception in every single game that he has started this season, 12 touchdowns and 10 picks this season for Wisconsin's starting quarterback. And then you look to the other side, Minnesota has a very good secondary, folks. They've got some talented guys back there, some young guys, but they've got some talented players certainly back there. Can Minnesota force some turnovers, bait Braden Locke into making some bad throws, into making mistakes to create advantageous situations for their offense? Now, I talk about Minnesota secondary and has been good, but they are tied for the Big Ten lead, 16 interceptions. But they only have 1 interceptions in the last 3 games. They went crazy 4 games ago, forcing a ton of picks against Maryland, creating some points off of it. Since then, like I said, 1 interception over the last 3 games. How does Wisconsin kind of battle within that? How can they try to avoid some mistakes? Well, I think they need to be able to run the football in this game, right? You need to get Tawi Walker going. You need to get Darian Dupree certainly going in this game, because if Wisconsin is not able to run the football and they lean more heavily into the passing game, you could see, like, Braden Locke has been, like, you saw it even last year and you've seen it even more this year, where, like, he had a good game against Nebraska last week. He threw 3 touchdowns. Now, it was a 34-10 game at one point in that football game, and they got more points and yards certainly as this game went along, but he had a pretty solid game. We've talked about peaks and valleys before. We've certainly seen some peaks and valleys with Braden Locke. There's times where he makes really good throws with a lot of zip across the middle, but then there's other throws in very key situations that he just missed. Right, there were throws that he just missed in that Oregon game a couple of weeks ago, certainly as well. But Minnesota played pretty well against the run. They defended the run pretty well against the Penn State Nittany Lions. If it wasn't for that Luke Reynolds fake punt, this is a Minnesota defense that would have held this Penn State rushing attack to under 100 yards. You got to feel really good if the Gophers can come up and stop the run, because then that forces Braden Locke to throw the football certainly a lot more over the top. I think that Minnesota could be prime for a Darius Taylor takeover in this one. Here, we said this coming into the season. I talked to Ryan Herrings from Locked On Badgers. I talked to a lot of Wisconsin people, and they kind of agreed with me. The Wisconsin defensive line was the weakness of the defense, and I think it's the weakness of this football team, right? This is a defense that is not very good against the run. They give up the second most rushing yards per game in the Big Ten, 163. They have the second least sacks in the Big Ten. Have noticed that all year long. They just have not been able to generate pressure. Just 16 sacks this season. So I think Minnesota can win the battle up front when they possess the football. I want to throw a trend out there with Darius Taylor because he might be due for a takeover. He has had 3 100-yard games this season. And they have been separated after that by 2 games sub 100. So he goes 100 yards. He has 2 that is sub 100. Then he comes back to 100. He had 124 yards against Nevada. He combined for 70 yards against Iowa and Michigan the next 2 weeks. After that, against USC, he ran for 144. After the USC game, he ran for 30 at UCLA and 81 versus Maryland. The game after that, 131 yards at Illinois. The last 2 games, combined 86 yards against Rutgers and Penn State. If that trend keeps going, Darius Taylor is going to have himself a 100-yard day against Wisconsin. And if Darius Taylor has a 100-yard day, what does that tell you? It tells you the run game is going, and it probably tells you that Max Brosmer is going to at least be able to do a decent job throwing the football down the field against this good Wisconsin secondary. I know Minnesota is coming off a couple of losses. I know that they were maybe expecting a little bit more when they were sitting right there with a 6-3 record. I think Wisconsin is going to go into the offseason with this being their last game. I think the Minnesota Golden Gophers go on the road and pull the Vegas upset in this game. I've got the Gophers 27 and Wisconsin 23. Like I said, I think Minnesota can win the battle at the line of scrimmage. I think that they can run the football in this game. I think they can protect Max Brosmer. It's been proven when Brosmer has time to throw back there, he can find his targets. He's a top 5, top 6 quarterback in the Big Ten, I think, when he has time to throw. And then when I look at Minnesota and how they defend, if they can find a way to at least slow down this run game, keep it under 150, you make Braden Locke throw the football a little bit more, you contain a guy like Vinny Anthony out on the perimeter. Look, I think Wisconsin can score. I got them scoring 23 points in this game, but I think Minnesota just has more, and I think I trust their offense a little bit more in this game. You guys know, okay, I've been a Badger fan, and it pains me for them to be in this situation, but maybe this will be all for the better. Maybe there will be some major changes within this Wisconsin program this offseason. That's what I got. Enjoy your leftovers. It is going to be an elite holiday. I am so excited for this double dip on Black Friday. I'm Big Ten Ted. We'll see you in the next one.
Thanks for watching Big Ten Ted, where it's all Big Ten all year long. Make sure to like the video to spread the word of Big Ten Ted to the masses, and subscribe to the channel for updates on Big Ten content that drops every day.